Hello and welcome back to What's Millie Making, where I'm Millie and this is a space where I talk about the past, present, and future of my making, mostly knitting. Today's video is going to be all about dupes. Specifically, I'll be talking about 10 free alternatives to petite knit patterns. My reason for wanting to make this video is twofold. One, because a few weeks ago there was this whole drama with people creating a Discord server where they were sharing pirated knitting patterns, and I think it came from this, it all stemmed from this one TikTok where the creator was basically like, the Sophie scarf is so free, it shouldn't be a paid pattern, like somebody just send me the pattern pirated please. And yeah, there's all this discourse around it. I don't know if I want to share all my thoughts here. If you have thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments. But one big takeaway I had when I watched that reel is like, you don't even need to steal the pattern. There's so many free resources out there that you can make a Sophie scarf legally. Like, you don't have to steal to make the Sophie scarf. There's YouTube tutorials, there's free patterns on Ravelry that are the exact same thing. Like, you don't need to go around stealing to do it. And then the second reason I wanted to do it is this year I am trying to keep track of how much I spend on patterns, because I was watching some people's 2024 recap and they talked about how much they spent on patterns and keeping track of that, and it's honestly something I never even considered. So this year I am keeping track of how much I spend on patterns, and my goal is to really think about before making a purchase. Like, I want to make the purchase when I'm ready to cast on the pattern, because when I look at through my previous years, like over the last 3 years, I have knit less than 50% of the patterns that I've purchased. So I want to look at my pattern library and also look at free patterns before making any pattern purchases. So in this video, I will talk about some petite knit patterns, and then I will also share the free alternatives that I found. Some of them you might have to make some modifications for them to be similar to the petite knit pattern. And I'm not saying, the point of this video is not to say that you shouldn't purchase petite knit patterns. I am a big petite knit fan. I've purchased more than 20 of her patterns and I've knit quite a few of them. I really like her pattern writing style, but maybe you don't have the budget to purchase the patterns, or maybe you're unsure if you like the item and you want to purchase the pattern and then end up not liking the item. So maybe if you download a free pattern, you can get an idea if it's something you would like to knit or not. Or maybe hearing me say like, okay, this is the difference between the free pattern and the paid pattern, and you will have to make these changes to the free pattern to get it to be like the paid pattern. And maybe hearing all that, you're just like, you know what, I would rather just purchase the paid pattern and have all that work done for me instead of having to do the modifications myself for the free pattern. So that is the reasoning for this video. The majority of these patterns are going to be accessory patterns, because one, it was inspired by that Sophie scarf video, and I know for myself, and I'm assuming for other people as well, I am more likely to pay for a garment pattern versus a non-garment pattern. Like, I will add sweater patterns to my cart and check out without thinking, but then if I'm adding like a scarf pattern or a hat pattern for the same price, I second guess myself. I'm like, do I really need to purchase it, or can I make something else? And I think it's just easier to find the dupes for the accessory pattern. So without further ado, let's get into the pattern. I should start off with the Sophie scarf slash Sophie shawl, as that is the one that, inspired this whole video. Now, both of these patterns, they are constructed in a very similar way. I think there's three main differences. One is the gauge. Number two is the increase rate. And number three is the final width of the scarf. So basically the number of increases that you work. And changing through all three of those variables will give you different sized scarf slash shawl. And the free pattern that I think you could use as the base for this is the Simple Thing. I have like a bajillion tabs open, so let me find it. Where did it go? Nope, not that one. Okay. The free pattern that I think is the base you could use as a base for this is the Simple Thing by Melina Brow. And this just goes over the basic construction of this type of garter scarf. You start off with the garter tab, do a bunch of increases until you reach your widest point, and then you can either knit straight for some time or you can start decreasing. It depends on the shape of the shawl slash scarf that you want. So if you want it to be a shawl, that means you would increase at a slower rate and you would do a greater number of increases. So you would have a longer and wider object, which would be a shawl. And then if you wanted to knit a dupe of the Sophie scarf, you would increase at a quicker rate and do a fewer number of increases. So you would have something that is not as long and not as wide, hence it would be a little scarf sort of thing. And there's so many project pages on both the Sophie shawl, the Sophie scarf, and the simple thing that you can just look at other people's project notes to see how many increases, how many rows they worked, and how big their finished object was, and then do the same thing basically to get a finished object the same as their size. I haven't looked at the simple thing pattern in quite a long time, but so her pattern is for a specific size, but like I said, it's very easy to make the modifications, and there's over 2,000 projects, and plenty of people have used this pattern to make dupes of the Sophie shawl or Sophie scarf, and you can just look at their project notes, see what rate they increased at, see how many stitches they had at their widest point, and see their finished object photos and the dimensions of their finished object, and have yourself a free Sophie scarf or Sophie shawl. The next set of winter accessories are basically dupes for a bunch of different beanie patterns. So I guess I should start off with the one that I have already knit. So I've knit the free version. I haven't purchased the Petite Knit version. I was going to, and then I found the free version. So this is the Hipster Hat by Petite Knit. It is a 2x2 all over ribbed beanie. So I think the two main differences for me when I'm looking at beanie patterns is one, how much space do they have at the top of the head, and number two is how is their crown shaping worked. Because as I've gotten into my winter knitting accessories era, I've been more observant of beanies that I see out in the wild, be it what people are wearing or what I see at stores. And I will say, I think hand knit beanies look a lot nicer than a lot of store-bought beanies because their decreases are often not as even or as nice. And since you are making something from scratch, you have a lot of control over how the finished object will look like. And I really, really like how the crown shaping is done on the hipster beanie. I think it looks very, very clean. And the free pattern, which is the 2x2 by Anne Gagnon, has the exact same crown shaping. So I think in the pattern photos, they look a little bit different because Petite Knit has updated her pattern photos so that there's a little bit more room on the crown of her head. And I think that's maybe more reflective of what the popular style is nowadays, versus if you scroll down on the pattern page, you can see older pattern photos where the beanie is sitting pretty tight to her head, which is what was popular when the pattern was first released. Now this is a very, very easy modification to make. Basically, you knit the hat longer before you start your decreases, and you have created a little bit of space at the top of the crown that way. And these two patterns are written for two different gauges, but again, I think that's something very easy to modify. So the hipster hat is written for a DK weight gauge, and the 2x2 hat is written for a worsted weight gauge. So you have to look at how many stitches are decreased in each round in the crown shaping, and as long as you cast on a number of stitches that is a multiple of 8, because you decrease 8 stitches on each decrease round, your pattern will work out. Be it you're using fingering weight or bulky weight, just make sure your cast on stitches is a multiple of 8. And if you don't want to knit a swatch and figure out what your gauge is and what size hat you'll get from that, yada yada yada, what you can do is you can follow what Rebecca did. She talked about in her latest podcast how she follows the stitch count from a free Pro Soho pattern that I think it was written for a DK weight gauge. So she followed the number of cast on stitches for that, and then she just followed the crown shaping for the 2x2 hat. And you could do the same for any gauge. So let's say you wanted to knit a bulky hipster hat. You could find a free bulky weight pattern, cast on the number of stitches that they say in that pattern, and then when it comes to the crown shaping, just follow the instructions for the 2x2 hat. It's something very easily customizable. I think the one major detail difference in the hipster hat versus the free pattern, I think Petite Knit does this in most, if not all, of the patterns that I'm going to talk about in today's video. It's that she adds in a double knitting section so that when you fold over the hat, it's supposed to sit a little bit more cleanly. That said, I did see both in people's project notes and other knitting podcasters talk about that they knit the first version as written, and then when they knit the hat again, they tend to skip the double knitting because it's sometimes it like doesn't stay in place and then it looks weird. Like for instance, I did some double knitting in the collar of this sweater, and because I sewed it down, it stayed in place. I personally don't really love double knitting when something is not sewn down, because then if it like shifts around, if it is not sewn down, then if the hat shifts, sometimes like the double knitting doesn't stay in place and then you have like a weird line and it doesn't look good. If I were to knit this hat, I would just stick to the free pattern because I don't need the double knitting, and I have the skill set and the knowledge of how I can adjust it for any gauge. The next hat is very, very similar, except instead of a 2x2 rib, it is a 1x1 rib, and that is the weekend hat. Similar to the hipster hat. This also, so I don't have the pattern, but just from like general knowledge and of looking at the free pattern, as long as you cast on a number of stitches that is a multiple of 8, it should work out. The free pattern alternative is also from the same designer. It is the Revelation hat by Anne Gagnon, and the crown shaping in this looks exactly the same as the crown shaping in the weekend hat, and the same modifications that I talked about for the hipster hat slash 2x2 hat also apply here. You can knit it 4 different gauges. You can knit it longer if you want more room in the brim of the hat, or you can knit it longer if you want to do a double folded brim instead of a single folded brim. These are all modifications that are very, very easy to make. And actually in the weekend hat pattern photos, I think you can see the double knitting is more apparent in this pattern, and to be honest, I think I kind of prefer the look of it without the double knitting. And again, I think when I was looking at project pages, a lot of people said that they just excluded the double knitting for the reasons I shared earlier. And then there's one last beanie pattern that I wanted to talk about. And this is an older Petite Knit pattern. I don't think it's as popular. It's the North Sea set. So this set comes with a scarf as well as a hat. The hat seems to me like a very, very classic shape. There's no like clear photos from Petite Knit of the crown shaping, but looking at the project pages, I was able to find some hats that look pretty similar. And it looks like, again, the decreases are worked in 4 quadrants, and the best free alternative I could find for this is the Baker's hat by Emily Russell. To be honest, I actually think I like the look of the Baker's hat better. I think maybe she decreases the stitches further than Petite Knit does, because I noticed in the North Sea set hat, sometimes there's like a little bubble at the top, which I think comes when you have too many stitches when you are casting off. Versus my Baker's hat, I think does an extra set of decreases, so you don't get that bubble. It has like that same 1x1 brim that you fold over, and then the rest of the hat is worked in a stockinette. Then that North Sea set also comes with a scarf, which is basically just a really, really long tube, and then it has nice finishings on both ends, so you don't get the rolled stockinette hem. I mean, if you like the rolled stockinette hem, you can have that too by just doing nothing at both ends. And the free alternative pattern for this is the Kilometer Scarf by Florence Miller. And she just made hers in a solid color, but it would be very easy to just add in stripes. You could totally make this a scrappy scarf. Now that I'm talking about it, I actually really like the idea of a scrappy stockinette scarf. I feel like I've seen a lot of people knitting the Berlin scarf, but I don't know if I would like a fuzzy scarf because I feel like it would just get in my lip gloss or lip balm. So maybe I will knit a scrappy kilometer scarf. The last headwear item that I found a free dupe for is the weekend headband. So this is just a 1x1 rib headband. I do think there are a few details in this pattern that the free alternative does not have. So the free alternative pattern for this is the Lena headband by Rochelle Bardella, and this one is knit for a fingering weight gauge versus the weekend headband, which has a worsted weight gauge. But let's just talk through the modifications. Number one, you could modify the needle size and the number of cast on stitches to make it work for a worsted weight yarn. So the same thing I was talking about for the hats, you could look at, for instance, the Revelation pattern, which is a 1x1 beading. Take the number of cast on stitches for that, and then just follow the instructions for the Lena headbands to make it a worsted weight version. And then the weekend headband has two details. So number one, it has those double knit folded over parts so that you have a clean fold over. And number two, she says that you Kitchener the beginning and end of the headband, and then it sits on the inside of the headband. So here's what I would do to use the free pattern to get the resulting weekend headband. I would start off with a provisional cast on, and then, so let's say the width of your headband is going to be two inches, so you're knitting 4 inches total. So I would start off with a provisional cast on, knit 1 inch, do your double knitting rows, knit 2 inches, do your double knitting rows, knit 1 more inch, and then Kitchener your live stitches to your provisional cast on, and voila, you have your weekend headband with the free pattern. I actually really like the look of the weekend headband and the Lena headband. I'm just unsure how it would work with my big head and hair. I feel like in the past, not hands knit ones, but when I've worn like earmuffs in the past that wrap around my head, they never seem to stay on top of my ear. And I like the way they look. I think they look cute. I'm just uncertain of the functionality for me. If you knit one of these, how do you find it works out for you? Like, does it stay in place or does it not? And in this case, I would do the double knitting rows because, like I said, you are sewing it down so it should stay in place. Then I have one last winter accessory, and that is the penny gloves. These are a plain stockinette fingerless mitten, and I have two different options for free alternatives. Option number one are the Duke City Mitts by Dagmar Benen's Bird, and these look very, very similar. They're just plain stockinette, and then you have like the rolled edges along your finger openings and then your wrist. I think the main difference between this pattern and the penny glove pattern is that I think the penny gloves have a slightly longer wrist, but that's literally the easiest modification to make. Yeah, the free version, I think the gauge is like 1 stitch off. The free version has a 24 stitch gauge versus the penny gloves, which have a 25 stitch gauge. Very, very similar with the free pattern. And I'm actually thinking of knitting myself a pair of these. The other free pattern that I was looking at for an alternative, the other free pattern that I was looking at are the stockinette hand warmers by Pearl Soho. Construction on these do look a little bit different because I noticed the thumb gusset on these like really stick out in a way that I haven't seen in other mitten patterns and are not there in the penny gloves. So I don't know if I would like that or not. Maybe I'll have to knit myself a pair and see how I like it. Because I do really like those arched gusset mittens that have a kind of funky thumb gusset shape from Pearl Soho. So maybe Pearl Soho just knows how to make funky but well-fitting thumb gussets. The last accessory pattern that I have a dupe for are these Sunday socks. So these are a 2x2 rib sock, knit cuff down with a heel flap and gusset and a worsted weight gauge. There are so many free sock patterns, even at a worsted weight gauge, so I did find two alternatives. Before I talk about those, I should say one interesting thing about the Sunday socks are they don't have a slip stitch heel. So traditionally when you knit a heel flap and gusset, you do one where you knit. I reapplied my lip balm, so let's get back to talking about the Sunday socks. As I was saying, I feel like in most heel flap and gussets, you do a slip stitch heel, versus in this pattern, the heel is just done in a fully stockinette stitch. But again, after looking at a lot of project pages and project notes, I noticed a common modification that people do are a slip stitch heel because it tends to be more long wearing than a stockinette heel. So the number one free alternative that I found for this are the Basic Beginner Bed Socks by Shelby Nichols. These are also cuff down, 2x2 rib, worsted weight, and this pattern does have a slip stitch heel. And then if you want a stockinette heel, I found If you want to stockinette heel, you can just skip the slip stitches in the beginner basic bed socks, but I also found a different sock pattern that has an interesting construction. It is the Dagron's Lugar by Roxanne Richardson. So at first look, it looks exactly like a heel flap and gusset with a stockinette heel, but apparently it has a different construction based off a sock knit by a Norwegian woman. I don't know who this Norwegian woman is, but I'm assuming she's a talented knitter. So those are all the accessory patterns that I found free alternatives for. Lastly, I have 3 sweater patterns. So I think for the accessories, it was easier for me to find dupes, and the changes you would have to make are pretty minimal. Versus the sweater patterns, I do think they look very similar. Like if I saw 2 people wearing the 2 sweaters that I talked about, the dupe and the original, I wouldn't be able to say like, that's a petite knit pattern, that's not the petite knit pattern. So functionally they look the same, but in terms of construction and the way that they're made, there might be some differences. So the first pattern, the first garment pattern that I found a dupe for is the Monday sweater. I actually think the OG dupe for the Monday sweater was the classic by Espas Tricot, but that is not a paid pattern. However, I think the original designer and owner of Espas Tricot is now the owner and designer for Sandra Yarn Co. And she just released a pattern at the end of last year that is very, very similar to both the classic and the Monday sweater. And that is the Hold the Line sweater. And it is published under Sunday Yarn Co. Similar to the Monday sweater, it's knit with a strand of lace and a strand of fingering. It is a top-down raglan knit in the round 21 stitch gauge. The biggest difference, I think, is that this Hold the Line has a 2x2 rib and the Monday sweater has a 1x1 rib. But as you know, that is such an easy modification to make. Just turn your 2x2 rib into a 1x1 rib, and boom, you have a Monday sweater. And I do think the Monday sweater has a shallower rib than the Hold the Line, so just knit fewer rows of ribbing. Next free sweater pattern alternative is for the Champagne cardigan, and this is also a top-down raglan, except this one is a cardigan and it has a double knit button band. And this one is written for a worsted weight gauge with worsted weight yarn with an 18 stitch gauge. And the free alternative is the Step by Step cardigan by Florence Miller. This one does have a 16 stitch gauge. So if you wanted to knit it to have an 18 stitch gauge, you would have to do some math, do a gauge swatch, and figure it out yourself. Or there's also a ton of resources if you just Google and search like how to knit a sweater off gauge. There's so many great resources to help you with that. Or you can just like wing it and like knit a size or 2 up. And all the details on this are the same. It has like the same raglan details, the same double knit button band. I'm pretty sure Florence uses the same like buttonhole construction that Petite Knit uses for the Champagne cardigan. They both have a V-neck. They are just very, very similar patterns. I think maybe the Champagne cardigan has a longer body, but length is literally one of the easiest modifications to make. And then the last sweater that I found a dupe for is the Novice sweater by Petite Knit. So this sweater has a special place in my heart because it is the first sweater that I ever knit. It's a very, very beginner friendly sweater. It's basically just a circular yoke. So you are always knitting in the round. There's no short rows and you are just doing a bunch of equally spaced out increases until you get to your body and you put your sleeve stitches on hold. Super straightforward, very, very easy. And I found 2 alternatives for this. It's just that the alternatives have different gauges than the original Novice sweater pattern. So first is the Sherwood Forest sweater by Drops. This one is knit with stripes, but so easy to end with those stripes, just knit it in one solid color. And then the better written pattern, in my opinion, versus the Drops pattern, is the sport weight alternative, which is the Knitted Cozy by MCL Knits. And I generally don't love circular yoke sweaters, but I think this one looks like it fits really well. I think the designer did a good job in terms of the fit, because I feel like when it comes to circular yoke sweaters, the depth of the yoke is very important, even more so than like a raglan or a drop shoulder, because if it's too long, it looks like a bat wing. But then if it's too short and it's too tight, it kind of looks like it's like constructing your shoulders. And I think this designer found that sweet spot for a circular yoke where it's just right, not too long, not too shallow. And yeah, that is a wrap up on all of the patterns. Hopefully there was something of interest for you there. Either you found some free patterns that you want to knit, or you're like, I don't want to make these modifications. So now I know that it's worth it for me to purchase a pattern. I know personally I'm going to be knitting both of the beanie patterns, the 2x2 ribbed one and the 1x1 ribbed one. And I'm also thinking of making the dupe of the penny gloves, because it's been so cold and sometimes my hands get cold even indoors. So I feel like making a fingering or sport weight fingerless mitten would be great, so I can still use my laptop but my hands are not freezing cold. If you are also planning on knitting any of these patterns, or you have insights on any of these patterns, please feel free to share. And as always, I'd love to know what's on your needles while watching this video, because I'm nosy and I love to know what other people are working on. My next video will be knitting podcast episode 13, and I will actually talk about my latest Petite Knit cast on. So last night I cast on the Celeste sweater. I actually talk about it a bit in the acquisitions section of my last knitting podcast. The sweater is written for DK weight wool, however I am knitting an all mohair version, and it looks so dreamy, and I think the pattern is very well written, as all Petite Knit patterns are. Like I said, I am a big Petite Knit fan. So the point of this video is not to say like don't purchase Petite Knit patterns ever. Just giving some alternatives, and do purchase Petite Knit patterns if you enjoy them, which I clearly do. So that's a wrap on this video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to give it a thumbs up and follow along for more videos. Like I said, my next video will be knitting podcast episode 13, I believe, the big one, 3, and it should come out in a week or two after this video. Until then, happy knitting, and if you're also in the northern hemisphere, I hope you are staying cozy and warm, and if you're in the southern hemisphere, I hope you are having a lovely summer. See you next time. Bye.